Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this special episode of IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is indeed a special episode because we're recording it on Monday, October 13th, 2025 at 10:15 in the morning, just hours after the remaining 20 hostages were released from Hamas captivity. We are still awaiting, of course, the bodies of the 28 deceased hostages. Now, just moments ago, both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Donald J. Trump addressed the Knesset, Israel's parliament. The U.S. president is now on his way to Sharm el-Sheikh to meet with world leaders to chart a plan forward for Gaza and indeed the region. And joining us now to make sense of it all is Shahar Azani, a regular guest here on the program. Shahar is a veteran Israeli diplomat, having served at Israel's foreign ministry for 16 years, including posts in London, Los Angeles, Jerusalem, Nairobi, and New York. He's a passionate advocate for Israel and a frequent contributor to various media outlets focusing on Israel, Jewish issues in the Middle East. Shahar is the CEO of the Book Family Foundation, as well as head of corporate social responsibility at Jet Support Services. Shahar joins us now on the line via Zoom. Shahar, good morning. What a day. Welcome back to IsraelCast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. It's always a pleasure to be back with you and with all of our listeners. And indeed, good morning to you and to the world.
And I think everyone is smiling that is Israel engaged. Indeed, this morning, Shahar, I know you and I both are. And listen, before we dive into our conversation, there's a whole lot to talk about. I do want to remind our very dear listeners around the world that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and continuing to help our brothers and sisters in need following the October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribe, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course. And we'd love it if you did that wherever you get your podcast. Just search for IsraelCast. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your orbit. And with that, we very warmly welcome Shahar back to the program. Shahar, what a day truly it is. Describe what this day really means for Israel.
You know, I want to say, Stephen, that it means a lot, not just to Israel and Israelis, but to every decent, justice-seeking human being all across the world. Anybody who bore witness to the atrocities of October 7th that manifested the purest, truly the purest level of evil on a medieval scale that we've seen, definitely the most horrendous day in modern Jewish history. To see those 20 hostages come back to their families, you know, Stephen, they've become family to us.
Yeah.
We know their names. We got to know their families, their life stories, their homes. We were emotional with every horrendous video that vile, barbaric, sadistic Hamas sent out of them. So to see them coming back is nothing short of a miracle, you know, and to see them all come back at once together is truly a dream come true. In the Israeli psyche, we've always expected sadistic Hamas that doesn't care about its own people, let alone Israel or the world, to try and hold on to some of them, to all of them, and to reach a moment where they're coming back, reuniting with their families is one of the most emotional moments we've experienced in this turbulent time. And I think the beginning, the very beginning of a process of healing for Israel and for Israelis, because that we have a long way to go there.
Yeah, and let's just focus on the hostages for a moment and what their healing process truly must be like. You know, the last guest that we had here on the program was Tal Shoam, who was held hostage for 505 days, 8.5 months of which were in the tunnels, and he shared his entire journey, his entire story with us. And I encourage everybody to listen to that. And he is still healing. And you don't just flick a switch and then you're okay. There's emotional pain, there's spiritual pain, and there's a lot of physical pain for many of them as well.
And a lot of guilt and
Yes.
survivor guilt, the people that you've been with, the sites that you've been exposed to. I believe that we haven't even begun to hear the beginning of it from these hostages and from those, by the way, who've been released already. It's definitely a long process for them. We know that we have the rush of coming back home and the immediate elation, but then again, there are, like you said, the physical obstacles and challenges. Many people commented on these last 20 hostages returning today as being extremely pale, which is indicative of their staying in the tunnels for a lengthy amount of time. That also has direct repercussions and consequences health-wise. We talk about the immense torment that these savages have put them through, and I'm talking about, torture of the worst kind. Testimonies that we heard from hostages who've returned, who were exposed for a minute or two when they heard the terrible noises, the screams, the chants, the so-called investigations that Hamas sadistic, barbaric terrorists have put them through. So it's definitely a long way to go physically. It's a long way to go emotionally. We know that so many of the October 7th survivors, Stephen, are still coping with it. Just a few days ago, Roy Shalev, who was the boyfriend of Mapal Adam, Mapal and her best friend Lihi were both murdered in front of Rui on that horrendous day. He was shot twice by the savages. He survived and he made it through 2 years and he became part of the Nova community, the Nova tribe survivors. And on the eve of the anniversary, he couldn't control himself and he couldn't cope with that pain and he took his own life. So in the most horrendous way to reunite with his loved one. So you know that this is an ongoing struggle. Israelis have never expected nor been exposed in this generation to the kind of sadistic evil that we've seen coming from Hamas. Sadistic evil that we learn from notes written, handwritten by the abominable Yahya Sinwar to be directed specifically and ordered. It wasn't just as a by the way thing in the so-called heat of the moment. This was a premeditated plan of torture, execution, and killing of the kind of which we have not seen. So it's going to be a while for us. And to say that the Jewish people is a people of perpetuity, it's a people of memory. Memory defines us, and we will never forget that Gaza has done to us and brought upon us and truly upon themselves.
Shahar, can you talk a little bit about how and why Hamas caved?
Yes, I want to say that this was an incredible diplomatic maneuver. You had a rare situation which President Trump led, but the Israeli Defense Forces, each and every soldier, Stephen, that went into Gaza from the get-go to this very moment, had the hostages on our hearts and our minds. This is what they were going for. This is what we dreamt of. This is what our warriors dreamt of, that moment when they're able to bring those hostages home. So Israel was able to execute significant military pressure on Hamas, eradicating systematically their tunnels and their terrorist infrastructure, chasing each and every one of these vile terrorists. It's famously known that Israel, for 2 decades, chased the perpetrators of the Munich massacre against the Israeli sports team in Munich. And just in a similar fashion, the General Security Service in Israel has a list of people who participated in the massacre, of those terrorists who acted on these horrible, barbaric, sadistic nature and did what they did on October 7th. And we know if we didn't get them already, we will get them. So Israel's persistent military pressure, combined with President Trump's unique style of diplomacy. And when I say unique style of diplomacy, I want to say no political correctness, the ability to look reality in the eye and acknowledge it for what it is, to call it like it is, and of course, the power of not just the position as president of the United States, but the personality. You don't mess with Trump. He has a temper. He's going to come and get you. And when he says all hell breaks loose and the gates of hell will open on Hamas and Gaza, he means it, as opposed to what we might have heard from other politicians, leaders, administrators that we're used to. He works beyond those rules and frameworks. And using that personality and position, he was able to maneuver an unbelievable diplomatic situation where Arab states and Israel stood alongside the United States and isolated Hamas. This was indeed brilliant. Now, with weakened Iran and isolated Hamas, they had no other choice because they had nobody to lean on. And he shifted the equation not to pressuring Hamas, but making it an obligation of supposedly his friends, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, to make sure that Hamas delivers on their promises. So that combination of position and personality combined with Israel's military might, dedication, and devotion have brought about a situation where Hamas looked at those hostages completely contrary to what all of us thought before, Stephen, not as an asset, but as a liability. And being a liability, they wanted to quote and get rid of them as quickly as they can so that they could move forward and regain the support of the Arab nations. As a result, by the way, you've seen in some Arab media outlets accusations against Arab nations as if they abandoned Hamas or deserted Hamas or left Hamas to rot. However, I do want to say that this is just the first phase, and we're going to touch upon it for sure.
Yeah.
We still have a long way to go in implementing the 20-point plan.
Indeed. And so what happens then, Shahar, to Hamas? And what do its patrons have to do then to ensure that they don't rise again? And what's in it then for really the patrons now moving forward?
Well, I think part of the reason that, Qatar has been a major patron of Hamas, being part of the Muslim Brotherhood and the greater axis of Sunni Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. And it was clear to them that Hamas is approaching its demise. And if Israel continues with its plan of entering Gaza City, which was the very hub of Hamas and one of the major last hubs that it actually had in Gaza, it's going to be very difficult to rise from the ashes. So cutting their losses, they pushed Hamas to accept this deal. And of course, they would want to see Hamas survive this process and being able to rise again in a matter of year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. Having said that, it's our obligation to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because what was clear to Israel is that we cannot survive, we cannot live alongside, sharing a border with a vile, barbaric, sadistic enemy that does not see any benefit for its own people aside from the destruction of the state of Israel. Stephen, we've gone through so many years of not looking reality of the eye, of telling ourselves lies. When we heard the chants coming from Hamas every day, it's not that we didn't know. We heard those chants. We saw them on Hamas TV, enacted by barbaric Mickey Mouse of sorts, teaching kids how to slaughter a Zionist and what's the ultimate goal of Hamas. But we kept on telling ourselves, oh, they're just being politically correct vis-a-vis their public. They're just using that kind of language to appeal to their own public for internal political reasons. But they're rational, they're reasonable, like all of us. They desire a better economy for Palestinians in Gaza. They're already in control, and they were, Stephen, of a whole territory, uninterrupted, controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood and so-called Islamic Caliphate, controlled by Hamas. They would never give that up because we applied our logic to them. And we didn't realize and we didn't agree to tell ourselves the truth, that they're nothing like us, that they believe in their extremist ideology and they're willing to sacrifice each and every Palestinian in Gaza to achieve their goal. And Iran is willing to sacrifice each and every Palestinians everywhere to achieve their goal. So I think the age of lies and masks is over. And we are on a new page. And now that Israel is welcoming its living hostages and hopefully very soon the 28 deceased ones, because you know how important that is as well to the families and to Israel, we will be able to redraw the map of the Middle East and to redefine our relationship with Gaza and with the Palestinians in a future that will not have a Hamas governing entity. It hopefully will not have a military, it will have a demilitarized Gaza and demilitarized Hamas. Are we going to be able to eradicate each and every Hamasnik or each and every Hamas thought? The West hasn't been able to do so to the Nazi regime in Skokie. We still have neo-Nazis in the very United States of America. So the thought of evil is there. But the ability to give that evil weapon and control and domination over population and territory, that has to be over.
So we talked about what this day means for Israel. What does this day mean for the people of Gaza and the Palestinians in general?
You know, that takes me back, Stephen, to the notion of how to look at this entire war. A
Mhm.
lot of people focused on Israel, Gaza, or Israel and Hamas, or, of course, the haters and the anti-Semites who would use lies to describe what was happening on the ground. But there is another way to look at all of this. I mean, look at this as the war of redemption for the peoples of the Middle East, led by the state of Israel. Think about Israel as this incredible beacon of light as it tries to and succeeds to release Lebanon of Hezbollah's stranglehold. Imagine, do you remember only in 2020 when there was this huge, massive explosion in the Beirut port?
Mhm.
And nobody dared to utter, we knew Hezbollah was to blame with their weapon depot, but it was difficult because of their military might, their control, their soldiers on the ground. Nobody messed around with Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah. And now, lo and behold, post Israel's war up north, suddenly Lebanon is regaining its sovereignty. The people of Lebanon dare to talk to Hezbollah about disarming, about taking over the border with Israel. We dream of having peace with the Lebanese people because we had no qualm with the people of Lebanon, aside from the Iranian embedded interest, which was Hezbollah inside Lebanon, using Lebanon as a pawn against Israel. So there is a real chance for the Lebanese people to reclaim their state and their lives. My father told me stories back of the day of how, Beirut is Paris of the Middle East.
Yeah.
We dream of that age to come again. We've seen the same in Iran. We saw the attack against the nuclear facilities, but there was one attack that I want our listeners and viewers to pay attention to, which was the attack that Israel conducted against the Evin prison in Tehran, which in the hope of releasing political prisoners, manifesting our hope that the Persian people will reclaim their land, their heritage, and their incredible country from the hands of the horrendous Islamic Republic that has dedicated all of these resources to spread death and destruction on a global scale, not just Israel or the Middle East, but South America and beyond, instead of investing in their own people who now suffer from shortage of electricity and water. I want to use the same language for Gaza. I want to say that we are now on the path, hopefully, to redeem Gazans from Hamas, and Gazans themselves have a long way to go, because after such, lengthy indoctrination of hatred and incitement for years, they need to go through this process of de-radicalization, but finally, there is a horizon.
I wanted to ask you exactly about that. You were reading my mind, Shahar, as you always do, is about how do you go about de-radicalization, not only among the population of Gaza, but in the larger Arab and larger Muslim world. And so I was just reading the other day, for example, that the World Gymnastics meet is going to be taking place in Indonesia. And originally Israel was going to be attending, but now Israel has been disinvited by the Indonesians. And we all saw the president of Indonesia get up at the United Nations, and he ended his speech with the word shalom. And he was very, let's say, cordial towards Israel and talked about Israel's need for safety and security. Yet he caved to those in his country who said, no go, Israelis are not coming here. So how do you begin to mend those fences and to build bridges and to de-radicalize when everyone has been taught hate and has been taught lies for generations?
Well, you're of course right, Stephen. What you're doing now is actually acknowledging the problem, which is something that I can tell you from my long diplomatic career. We've always talked about education, incitement, and hatred, but it always ended up being number 4, number 5 on our messaging. We talked about Jerusalem, we talked about the settlements, we talked about refugees, we talked about two-state solution or delusion, but we chose to use this as somewhat of a talking point. And I think we all paid the price for not acknowledging this as a real problem on October 7th. And I think to myself, I'm, I'll say young enough, but we know old enough to remember, the Oslo Accords and the
Listen, I'm
signing of the
older than you,
Declaration.
Shahar, so I'm even old enough to remember before that.
And the Declaration of Principles and
Yeah.
the heightened sense of, almost messianic, a period of time when we were envisioning a period where maybe our kids won't have to go to the army, and the Oslo Accords are coming, and this reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. So the first step would be acknowledge the problem. And when you acknowledge the problem, you're also seeing these buds of change from the president of Indonesia's Shalom at the UN to the whispers today, Stephen, about a potential visit by the president of Indonesia to Israel on his way back from Sharm, which they're saying will not happen, but still that very chatter is there. So we have an opportunity to change. Change needs to come not just on the top, but also bottom up. And this is where it gets difficult, because when we allowed, and I'm mentioning Oslo because it's been, what, 30 years? And in the course of these 30 years, we allowed this education and incitement, this maleducation and incitement to take place in Palestinian schools. And we told ourselves, oh, it's just school. But this is the next generation of Palestinians. And when we're not paying attention to what's happening there, then we'll pay the price in 5, 10, 20 years. And we did. Look at all of these savage terrorists that perpetrated the most horrible deeds. Most of them were young. There were people in their 20s who came to slaughter, rape, kill, and maim, who treated Jews like they're subhuman, non-human, in the most inhumane treatment ever. And this is something that we will have to address head on as Israel, to put it on top of our diplomatic priority, to insist that UNRWA schools are not able to continue the way they did. UNRWA, it always makes me laugh, because when you look at UNRWA, UN, UNRWA, in Hebrew, it's like bad UN, right? UNRWA. So you look
and
at
explain
UNRWA.
listen, we have a global audience. Not everyone is
Right.
familiar with
You're
what
right. You're
UNRWA
right.
is. So share what UNRWA is, please.
Right. United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the only refugee agency established by the United Nations to take care of Palestinian refugees. Just for our global listeners and viewers, you have the United Nations High Commission for Refugees that takes care of all refugees. And then you have a specific agency for the Palestinian people. Is that fair? I'm not taking anything away from Palestinians who may have issues, but is that fair that you have one agency only for the Palestinians and one for the rest of the world? I'm not sure that it even makes sense, but I'm leaving this for our viewers and listeners to think about as a point of action on a general level, not in the pro or anti-Israel conversation. But in these UNRWA schools, in these UN schools, you had Hamas staffers who taught the same exact hatred that they were teaching in their summer camps. We allowed this to happen, Stephen. We allowed this to take place. Now we cannot. We have to make sure that Palestinian society undergoes this de-radicalization process. And here comes the Islamic point. In the Islamic tradition, one of the most important principles is sabr, patience. And I think we as Western societies need to espouse the same kind of patience. Something may not happen in a month. Something may not happen in a year. Goodness gracious, Stephen, something might not even happen in a term. It may take 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 50 years. And you know what? That's okay, because that's the only way you can plant the seeds for a better future for all of us. Israel will never allow such hatred to fester again on our very border. And when you think about, again, I go back to October 7th, and I think about the Kotz family. The two older boys, the teens who came back home from their school that weekend, came back because their father was planning another, kite flying by the fence to showcase neighborly relations with Gazans. Mm-hmm. That's the Kotz family. These are the values that we espouse. And they all found their death on that horrendous day, ended up dead on their bed, hugged together, because dying on the altar of their beliefs. This is one of the most important lessons of October 7th and the most crucial arenas we have to operate in if we are to seek a different future for Palestinians and for Israelis.
Shahar, I want to focus now on the Abraham Accords, and then I want to talk about President Trump's 20-point plan, and then also what he calls the Board of Peace, which I absolutely love the term, and I love what it's all about. The Abraham Accords, interestingly, over the last couple of weeks, I've spoken to a number of Jewish friends of mine, and I had 3 out of 3 that did not know what the Abraham Accords were. And these are all people that have a point of view about Israel and the Middle East, yet they never heard of the Abraham Accords, which I found rather shocking. And I found it rather um, uh, surprising, considering that they have a quote unquote point of view about the Middle East. So,
Right.
in a sentence, share for anyone that does not know what the Abraham Accords are, what they are, where do you think that it's going to be going, who do you think might join on next, and so forth. Because I
So
certainly have my own wish
right.
list about who can join.
I agree. And not just the wish list, Stephen. You also have the knowledge and the intimate knowledge about so many of these potential partners,
Well,
which
I've
I
been
think is
honestly,
very unique.
Shahar, I've been to all those countries.
Right,
Okay.
right. And so
So
you understand how incredible, you
yes.
truly, and when you think about, people who don't realize what the Abraham Accords, these were the Jared Kushner, President Trump first term, U.S. Sponsored and supported peace agreements between the Gulf states and Israel and Morocco and Bahrain, who jumped onto the peace wagon. By the way, and a very important point to mention that since those times of the first term, we went through the Biden term, we went through the Gaza war, and these agreements are still standing. So this is where I think politics becomes a bit
And can I
poisonous.
just interrupt you for a
Yep,
moment? Where
yep,
so many airlines stopped flying to
right.
Israel. Who
Very
flew to
true.
Israel? El Al
True.
and one of the Emirati airlines, right?
Right. Abu Dhabi, Etihad, that's very, very true. That's
Yeah.
very true. You couldn't help noticing this, that they continued on their routes, and that show you the durability of peace and the durability of, I want to say, building peace, because we talk about peace as an end game, but it's not an end game, it's a beginning. It's a process when you started seeing the textbooks in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE change and start to describe history differently. When you see the Holocaust commemoration in Abu Dhabi, when you see it in places where you would never expect to see it, like Jerusalem or Washington. And I think that's a process that the Arab world, and I think these leaders of the moderate Sunni regimes understand that this is the path they need to take in order to bring their peoples and their nations into the 21st century rather than to drown in the quagmires of the past. But at the same time, this is where, Stephen, I find politics to be very poisonous because just Trump as in Bibi, we live in a world where either everything they do is incredible and nothing they do is worthwhile. If I hate you, I hate you to the core. And you saw the Abraham Accords, even the Biden administration coming into power was squeamish about these accords and somewhat hesitant in embracing them and acknowledge, not to mention the Nobel Peace Prize, committee that was so quick to give one to President Obama after 9 months in office for being. And then President Trump, who actually brokered the impossible, was somehow left out, even now, funnily enough, acknowledged for it by Israel, by the hostage families, and even by the winner, Ms. Machado of Venezuela. So it was incredible to see this reality. So when you think about the Abraham Accords and you think about ignorance in general, people have a viewpoint. I remember on the Bill Maher show a couple of years ago, he interviewed John Legend. And John Legend said something about the singer, said something about it's important that we as Americans stand by the Palestinians. And one of the panel members asked John Legend, he said, John, what's your position on the death squads in Venezuela executing demonstrators as we speak? And John Legend looks at him and says, I don't know, about that. Said, but yet you're so quick to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And he said, oh, because that's always on the news. So you see, it becomes what we've seen from so many corners of this world, especially Hollywood, this virtue signaling of if I say something about the Palestinians, but you don't really know what are the undercurrents in the region, the way you do, Stephen, to understand what the Abraham Accords are, to understand what the nature of resilient peace is, to understand the shared interests of modern, free, loving societies in standing up against the forces of retardation and terror that are threatening our region, that there are much deeper interests. Just like the Prime Minister Netanyahu alluded to, the kind of conversation he's been having with Arab leaders in the course of this war, and the kind of statements that some of these leaders and states were making outside of those, clandestine discussions. So there is a great amount of education that we have to do, Stephen. And I take that blame upon us, upon me, upon our community, and of course, the responsibility of the State of Israel to do much more to disseminate that information, to get more listeners on your podcast, Stephen, both of them, by the way, to share that
Are you
knowledge and
saying, I mean,
understanding.
podcasts are both listeners?
Yeah. For people to learn, educate yourself before you speak, understand a bit more. And for people not to know about the Abraham Accords is truly a shame.
Yeah. And so, just really briefly, before we move on to President Trump's plan, which countries do you see in the horizon? I learned not to ask, can you look into your crystal ball? What I learned to ask is, what are the likely scenarios? If you can just be quick on this one, because
Okay,
I
we
have my
hope we
list.
hope to we hope to see Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
We hope to see more countries join in areas that we never imagined, like Indonesia and others. And I think we're going to be surprised. I think we live in truly historic times of great surprise. And just like we've seen 20 living hostages coming back from the dead, I expect more miracles coming from this administration.
Yeah, I see definitely Indonesia. I definitely see Lebanon. I've been to Lebanon, and the Lebanese people are like the Israeli people. Really,
Right, they
you can
are.
just open the border and it would be like one big country because
I agree.
there's so many. Go ahead.
If it weren't for that show of, what we're seeing is Hezbollah standing in between,
Exactly.
literally, physically in between. You saw the display this week of the Hezbollah scouts saluting in the Heil Hitler fashion in that stadium in a show of force, vowing never to
Yeah.
put down their weapon. I do hope that Lebanon joins for sure. Who knows? They're talking about Syria.
And
A
exactly.
discussion was in Israel about the return of the remains of Eli Cohen, our man in Damascus, potentially to Israel. Huge shifts in the region, and I hope that Israel will be wise enough to ride that wave along with the president and other partners in the region.
I actually have another really quick question before we get on to President Trump's plan. Um,
It's always so short, Stephen. Why do
I
we
know
get
our
this?
conversation. I feel like I could have a
So
12-hour
short.
conversation with you.
Yeah.
Um, how does Israel begin to repair relations with its, I'll call them allies, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France, those countries that they have diplomatic ties, there's very strong trade ties, but yet those countries have been very outspoken against Israel and, of course, recognized a Palestinian state. So what needs to happen there, Shahar?
I'll be a little bit, I'll stray away from the mainstream and I'll say this. The Eurovision contest is, one of the most, popular contests in Israel. And I think the Eurovision this year told a great story because in the Eurovision, the Israeli Yuval Rafael, a Nova survivor, was voted down by the elites, by the judges. She didn't get a lot of support from the judges, the panels in each
Mm-hmm.
European country. But she was voted as the people's choice
Mm-hmm.
in all of these countries. So I really do believe that when you have weak leadership that succumbs to the vocal minority, that's what you've seen by Starmer and of course Macron and others. But the truth is, and it is my wholehearted belief, that the silent majority is with us because they understand the dangers and they understand that Israel is at the forefront battle for the free world, not just for Israel, but for themselves. And our mission is to awaken that silent majority into action, to elect the right people and to make the right choices. So I think that again, I go back to education. Fight the bad one, spread the good one. Tell the story of Israel the way it should be told. For instance, the redemption equation, like we shared before. Give people a different viewpoint of the reality and provide them with the facts quickly so that they're able to fight back the antidote against the disinformation and misinformation that exists out there.
All right.
Fight the algorithm.
Now, I've been referencing it a couple of times, so let's go for it now. President Trump's 20-point plan. What do you want to share? What should we know? What could potentially be some difficulty, Shahar, do you think, moving forward with it?
Well, I think, Stephen, you alluded to it. You mentioned that one of the main pillars of the plan that Trump has for the future will be demilitarizing Gaza, dismantling Hamas's weapon, taking away its control over Gaza, and maybe exiling its leadership to other countries so that they're out of, unable to use Gaza again as a platform to send such attacks into Israel and to destabilize the region again. I think this is where the difficulty lies. We are starting a journey, that starts with the return of the living hostages and the deceased ones, but will end up reshaping the lives of Palestinians and Israelis and the greater region for generations to come. And I think that we are already seeing on the ground, Hamas, as we speak, in the days following the ceasefire agreement, and I'm saying ceasefire because peace is going to take a while, have already started executing people on the streets of Gaza, taking out people who they view as opposition to the rule, taking out voices of opposition who wanted to be a free society in Palestine, people that we know have been very much against Hamas's rule of torture. In the course of the war, Israel has been able to put its hands on numerous videos showcasing Hamas's brutality against its own people, trying to inflict its own rule of terror on Palestinians. So we're going to see a lot of resistance from Hamas. We're going to see a lot of resistance from those espousing them. We're going to see a difficulty in making a decision or finding the right entity to control and manage Gaza. Who is going to be that entity? Is it going to be the Palestinian Authority that is using the same kind of incitement in Judea and Samaria? Only there we have the military might and continuous presence to stop the acts of terror from coming in. That's a difficult situation for Israel. Is it going to be Hamas? Maybe are moderate Arab regimes going to be willing to put Arab soldiers on the ground? I hope they do, because I definitely don't want to see Israel Defense Forces managing the Gaza Strip for a lengthy amount of time. We left the Gaza Strip not in order to return, but at the same time, our security is paramount. So a lot depends on them, and a lot depends, Stephen, on us, because we can choose to look the other way. We can choose to refuse looking reality in the eye, and we can choose not to. And I think post October 7th, we have to look reality in the eye and enforce the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, just the way we do in Lebanon and elsewhere, and keep that threat as a viable threat on the table. No longer can Hamas assume that Israel will be hesitant to use its military might against them. They need to know that we will act whenever we need to, against whomever we need to act. And if I may, I want to add something that's important beyond the 20-point plan for us here in the United States. I mentioned how before October 7th, we looked the other way when chants of death echoed on the streets of Gaza and then manifested themselves on October 7th. On the second anniversary of October 7th, we heard the same chants. Glory to our martyrs, Stephen, on 6th Avenue in New York. Globalized the Intifada by a would-be mayor of this city, New York City. And when you think to yourself, what are you going to do here in the US when they're telling you what they want? They're calling for the enactment of a mass murder. They're calling out against the NYPD. They're calling us hateful slogans against the United States of America. And I think part of the unmasking of post-October 7th world, it's obligatory for us to act against this threat and not look the other way. We have to be able to identify those who may be a potential threat to our society and democracy and make sure to put that threat in jail before it manifests itself here the way it did in Israel. Israel already made this mistake. I hope we do not. Believe them when they tell you who they are.
Well, you also have to believe them when they tell you who they aren't and when they don't speak out, because now that there's a ceasefire, where's Cynthia Nixon? Where's Mark Ruffalo? Where's all these people in Hollywood and Greta Thunberg and so on, and the list goes on. So, but I have to say, I'm interested to see who's going to be on this board of peace that President Trump has created. Of course, I think he's going to be the chairman. We know that Tony Blair is going to be actively involved. So if you have global leaders that have some degree of respect, there aren't too many of them these days.
True.
You know, listen, I'm old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan.
Same. Yeah.
You know, those leaders don't exist anymore, or at least they're far and few between. So I think that'll be a coming attraction.
And we hope that out of destruction there will come great creation. And you know what it leads me to think, Stephen, about that bullet? Do you remember the attempted assassination against the president?
Yes.
And can you imagine how a bullet can change the world? Thank God that President Trump is here and was able to achieve what
I want to tell you, you know, being a man of faith, one has to look at this and say that he was put here at this moment for the right time, that he did not win the previous election, and that bullet didn't hit him. And I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, but I think we all have to be very grateful that he's in the White House now and he's fostering all of this right now, because I don't think any other American could have done that.
By the way, for Israel, but for the United States of America.
Listen, and for the entire region. And for the entire region. Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, his fostering of relations with Qatar. We all know what Qatar is all about. And I get that. We're not going to talk about that, but at least his fostering relations. And I am actually hopeful that Qatar will join the Abraham Accords because let's
Right.
face it, all of these Gulf countries recognize the fact the oil is going to dry up one day
Yep.
and they need to drive their economies. And
Right.
Israel is an economic powerhouse when it comes to that. And
Yes.
Israel
A
has
miracle.
what of
Yep.
course they all need. So as we
Well, the president mentioned Iran. Not that I think they'll
yes,
join, but he thinks big.
well, this is the thing, as you know, in the Middle East, how many times do people say no before they say
Right.
yes? So, of
Right.
course, I know Iran's not technically the Middle
Right.
East, but I'm saying the larger world.
No, but the
Of
larger
course, they're
world.
going to say no. They're not going to say, okay, maybe that's a good idea. Of course, they're
Right.
not going to. But you know what?
I don't know that, let's say,
That's the beauty of
yeah.
President Trump, right? He's a
Right.
bull in a china
Exactly.
shop.
Right. Exactly.
As the New York Post put on its cover the other day, as it relates to
Yeah.
China, you got to love the New York Post there. So
You
listen,
gotta love the New York
as we
Post.
wind down our conversation right now, I tell you, Shahar, I feel like again, there's so much to talk about
So
in
much.
the moment that we're living in right now. But as we really wind down our conversation right now, what do you think the next sort of 3 to 6 months look like, and what should we then be listening for, and should we be looking out for? Anything that should capture our attention moving forward?
I think that these are going to be decisive few months in Israel because you're going to see once the war winds down and the
Mhm.
focus shifts to the future of Gaza, which is going to be many, many years to come. You're going to see the intensification of the discussion within Israel. I think Israel will go towards elections. This is, in any case, 2026 is an election year in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very interesting to see Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Prime Minister during the massacre of October 7th, the prime minister for 17 years before the massacre of October 7th. Is he going to rise in the polls and be reelected by the Israeli people as prime minister? I think there is going to be a lot of work done inside Israel. And I urge, if you can go visit Israel, if you can support Israel, if you can support Israelis, this is not, we're just at the beginning when we spoke about this at the start of our conversation, dealing with our traumas, supporting the thousands of wounded IDF soldiers, supporting the shattered families, the bereaved families, the Nova survivors. There are so many people in Israel who need that kind of help. Israel will rise, and it will rise like it never rose before. I'm a strong believer in the ability to be reborn post this war, and this war has brought with it a lot of ingenuity and innovation in the most horrible of ways, but it did because that's the nature of our people. We are the happiest, most optimistic people in spite of everything. So I think that a lot of focus on internal Israel is
Mhm.
what we need to do at the moment to help Israelis move from this phase to the next one, on the global stage and inside Israel.
And to end on an optimistic note, people talk about PTSD for sure. And God knows that the hostages are going through that.
Right,
However, there's also PTG, post traumatic growth. And I'm
right.
hearing from you that we have to look at the post traumatic growth for Israel and indeed for the Jewish people and indeed for the region.
You're already seeing it, even
Yeah.
from hostages who've returned. Their sense of peoplehood, their sense of Judaism, their sense of self has grown significantly, and so it has for the entirety of the people of Israel. I remember how we know how to come together, not just as a people of Israel, but as a Jewish people. I have traveled the country, north to south, east to west, spoken at many JNF conferences, meeting with so many people, and I have seen the pulpit heart of the Jewish people. I have seen our younger generation. This is what I'm taking with me, Stephen. We looked at our younger generation somewhat, disparagingly, that the screenagers, the TikTok generation, they rose like lions in Israel, and they rose like lions right here in the United States. When I met students who spoke to me, young students who said, before they called me a kike, I didn't really understand my Jewishness. Now, this is who I am. And I think we can be really encouraged by the sense that we have not just a future, but a great future inside and outside of Israel.
And on that note, Shahar Azani, we're going to leave it right there. It is always such an honor and pleasure to speak with you. We
Thank
want to
you.
thank you so much for joining us on this very important, special, happy, memorable day here, indeed, in
Indeed.
the United States, Israel, and for joining us here on IsraelCast. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shehayanu.
All right, you said it. And we'll have info about Shahar on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. Don't forget to rate and review us because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more people around the world to find us and to hear from extraordinary people like Shahar. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman. We also thank Jessica Menton and our editor, Jay Rothman. The music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, I'd love to hear from you. And Shahar, I think you'd love to hear from our audience, wouldn't you?
I agree with you completely. Any audience of yours.
Right. So do email Shahar and yours truly and all of us here on IsraelCast at israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.